From our State House studio in Montgomery, I'm Todd Stacy. Welcome to Capitol Journal. We begin tonight with a story that shook up the political landscape over the weekend, the ouster of Dr. Barbara Cooper as Secretary of the Alabama Department of Early Childhood Education. Governor Kay Ivey on Friday announced that Cooper had resigned over the use of a teacher training manual that the governor said contained, quote, woke concepts. The governor's office in a press release cited two examples from the book, one discussing white privilege and that, quote, the United States is built on systemic and structural racism, end quote, and another that Ivey's office claimed teaches LGBTQ inclusion to 4-year-olds. As secretary, Cooper presided over the state's highly touted first-class pre-K program that is consistently ranked as the nation's best for quality. Dr. Jan Hume will take over as interim secretary. The legislature will return to action Tuesday as the session nears its halfway point. One issue many expect to be a top focus is crime. In particular, state prosecutors and the business community are asking the legislature to enact a law cracking down on retail theft, including organized retail theft. They say the problem will lead to more store closures if the issue isn't addressed.
The largest member of one of the largest members of the Groceries Association is about to announce that they're going to be closing half of all their stores in Chicago due to theft. Half of the largest member of the Groceries Association in America is about to close half their stores in Chicago because of theft. That should send a chill down your spine because what happens in Chicago happens here soon thereafter. So it is happening here, but that's a massive amount of stores closing at one time. It's shocking. So.
I've had one big box store, a national chain, that told me the number one reason they closed in the city of Montgomery was due to retail theft. I have another big box store, a national chain, which has told me it is crippling their business. So that is a huge issue in my community of Montgomery. I know it's a huge issue in the state of Alabama, especially in our major metropolitan areas, and of course across the United States.
Lawmakers will also be talking about the issue of street racing. House Bill 29 from State Representative Alan Treadaway is expected to be in committee this week. Senator Roger Smitherman is carrying the Senate version.
And if you don't know what this is what he's come down the street, do donuts in the middle of downtown. We've had 4 people to get killed because the folks are out there with those cars guys patrol. And I actually saw this myself in Midtown. If you ever down right in the Midtown, that new area down there. I'm sitting on a balcony and I'm looking down there and I'm seeing them doing donuts and spinning, and this is where people were in the area, not right there, but in the area where about 20,000 people live. Is where you got miles people going. You got all these folks out there walking around on the streets and living in these places, and these people coming down there. So the law does not permit officers to be able to strictly enforce this. Just some little misdemeanor way it is now.
The House convenes at 1 o'clock and the Senate goes in at 2:30. And we'll be right back with tonight's guests.
You can watch past episodes of Capitol Journal online anytime at Alabama Public Television's website, aptv.org.
Joining me next is Kim Boswell, Commissioner of the Alabama Department of Mental Health. Commissioner, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks, Todd. I'm glad to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Well, we're talking about 988. A lot of people may not realize that 988 is a crisis hotline, kind of similar to 911 for mental health reasons. Can you explain sort of how that works and how it came about?
Yes, absolutely. 988 is really the new 911 for a mental health crisis. So if you're having difficulty, just like now if you have a health emergency, you call 911. If you're having a mental health emergency, then you can dial 988 and get the services that you need. And so if you dial that number, there's a counselor on the other end of the phone who can help you figure out what's going on. If you need someone to come to you, of course, we can deploy our mobile crisis teams, or if you need someplace to go, you can go to one of our crisis centers. And just in the 6 months, actually 9 months almost now, since 988 started, we've had over 30,000 contacts.
Wow.
So calls, texts, and chats. So that gives you a little bit of an idea of how much need is out there.
So word has gotten out.
Yes.
That's good. Well, I have to imagine that part of it is, not everybody needs to call 911. That's not, you can't overload that system. It's a different need.
Unfortunately, that's what happens a lot of times when someone is in a mental health crisis. If they don't know where to go and they don't know who to call, then their natural tendency is to dial 911. And unfortunately, if you dial 911, you're going to get EMS or law enforcement or both. And of course, if EMS comes or law enforcement comes, they have limited opportunity. They're either going to take you to the emergency department, or sometimes if law enforcement comes and they have no other option, they may wind up taking you to jail. And so law enforcement is very excited. I've talked to a lot of different groups around the state, and law enforcement is really, really excited about this because this gives them an option to take folks to a crisis center to help them connect to services so that you get a mental health response during that crisis instead of the law enforcement response.
Mm-hmm. Well, look, this is a state service. This is a service just like a lot of services that are provided. Those services cost money.
Right.
And so there's going to be legislation, I understand, to bolster some funding to actually support this and fund it properly.
Correct. So the Alabama 988 Act would, in essence, help us fund the life-saving crisis services that we have begun over the last 3 years. We've been on your show many times talking about crisis services. The dilemma is those services are not available statewide. So we don't have a crisis center in every community. We don't have mobile crisis teams. We need additional funding for our call centers to respond to those 988 calls. And so really what we're proposing is a 98-cent surcharge on cell phone usage as a way of generating revenue so that we can expand crisis services across the state. That's very similar to the way 911 is currently funded. Currently, everyone pays a surcharge on their cell phone for the 911 services we have in our state. And so really with the national act that was passed in 2020, the FCC allowed for surcharge on cell phone usage for 988 and crisis services. And so this is Alabama's effort to really be able to take that federal legislation and implement it in Alabama and generate revenue so that we can have those life-saving services all across the state.
Mm-hmm. Well, there are different ways to fund things here in the legislature. Sometimes you put things in your budget and count on the general fund. This is different though. This is a standalone bill with that 98-cent surcharge, like you said. Why did you choose that route instead of asking for a appropriation?
So we think it's a pretty heavy lift for the general fund. As you know, we've received a significant increase in funding in the general fund over the last 3 years. This would generate about $68 million in revenue to have those services statewide. I'm one of those people that survived proration the last time. And so really for me, I get a little concerned about proration. We took a $40 million cut in our budget the last time proration hit, and we pretty much dismantled the mental health system over that time period. And so really, it's a pretty big lift for the general fund, and this is a way, especially when we're looking at inflation and revenue that we've seen in the general fund, I get a little nervous about our ability to sustain those kind of increases in the general fund. Even though the legislature has done a fantastic job of shoring up the revenue streams for the general fund, we do get a little concerned about how sustainable that is over time. This revenue would be available to us in 2025, so it really wouldn't have a budget impact in 2024. And so with that in mind, we were really concerned about, are we going to be able to sustain the kind of funding that we've seen for crisis services? And we really do want to protect that funding and build on the funding increases that we've already seen in the general fund, because they've been very generous with us. The governor and the legislative folks have been very generous in funding crisis services.
Well, and also, I mean, it's very much like 911. It's a user fee. You don't know when you're going to need it, but you're glad
Right.
you have it when it happens. We only have a few minutes left. I wanted to ask you for an update. You mentioned the crisis centers. This has been a real big endeavor for your office and the legislature funding it, building up these crisis centers throughout the state. Where are we? I'm kind of losing count of where we are and where they are.
Right. So we have 3 crisis centers that are fully operational, that have been operating fully in calendar year 2022. And just to give you an idea, for those crisis centers during that time, we had 412 people show up at a crisis center who were contemplating suicide. So we really feel like the model works. We have proven data. So those 3 centers have been operating for longer than a year. In Jefferson County, we have a crisis center that really just became fully operational about a month ago. So that's our 4th crisis center in Birmingham. And then in Tuscaloosa as well as Dothan, they are in the process of standing up crisis centers in those communities. We anticipate that they'll have at least temporary operations over the next couple of months.
Wow. Well, it's just interesting to hear you talk about it, because I remember the days of the mid-2000s when just all those cuts and cuts on top of that. And it seems to be, it's definitely become a priority for this legislature and for the state. And so congratulations on that. I know there's a long way to go,
Right.
but at least it seems like there's been some progress.
Thank you.
Well, we're out of time, but thanks again for coming by and explaining some of this stuff.
Thank you, Todd.
We'll be right back. Joining me next is Leah Nelson, Research Director at Alabama Appleseed. Leah, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
You noted that it is Victims' Rights Week, and you have a new report called Afterward, dealing with really looking into victims and how the state sort of deals with that and how communities kind of deal with it. Can you walk me through the high points of what your research found?
Yeah, sure. So I think, as you know, Appleseed tends to work on issues around mass incarceration. We've represented individuals who are sentenced to die in prison and gotten some of them out. This was a little bit of a pivot for us. And it happened because as we spend time in the communities that our guys, the men that we represent, the people on whose behalf we advocate, as we spend time with them and really get to know them and hang out in their communities, we were hearing a really complicated story that we felt needed to be further explored. So we're often looking at things like fines and fees. What happens after people are punished? Mm-hmm. Are they able to meet the mark of that punishment? Do punishments in Alabama make sense? What we were hearing at the same time as people who had been excessively punished were talking to us was that they also have experienced a lot of violence and victimization in their lives. In particular, my colleague, Callie Greer, who has lived in Selma and Montgomery, talks a lot about things like owing fines and fees and that being very frustrating to her. She's spent some time in prison, but she also lost her adult son to homicide in Montgomery on Father's Day about 25 years ago. And Callie and many, many, many other people talk in this very nuanced way about their experience of the criminal legal system and what happens when crime and violence occurs. So what we did was go back into those same communities that we're often working with, sort of on the defense-oriented side, and ask them about their experiences with violent victimization and the loss of loved ones to violence. So we went all around the state and we surveyed 401 people who have either personally experienced violence, sexual assault, being shot or shot at, being raped, or who have lost loved ones to homicide. And we asked them kind of what happened afterwards. Was there ever a point where they got what they needed from the system? What would they have wanted in addition to what they got? What would they have wanted instead of what they got? What would they do differently if they could wave a magic wand?
Mm-hmm. Well, I noticed you profiled Summer Stervient from Selma, and this is a compelling story. And like you said, she herself wasn't the recipient of the violence, but she had a brother that died, and it catalogs all of her frustration with dealing with a system that maybe doesn't seem very well equipped to do this. So I was going to ask you, what would it take? Is it a funding thing? Is it a resource thing? Or is it more of a change of focus type thing that you would seek from these findings?
Well, funding is always an issue, but money follows our values, right? We fund the things that we care about, or at least we try to. So Summer was 25 years old a couple of years ago when she got a phone call from a panicked friend who told her that her brother had been shot in Selma. Summer was right around the corner, so she raced to the scene, and she actually got there before any first responders did. And her brother was shot in the head. He was still alive, but he was dying. He was her younger brother, but was already a young adult himself, so he had a small son as well. Her brother died on the scene, and they arrested the man who shot him, and that man is still waiting for trial. You know, it takes a long time in a murder case to get together everything that you need and decide what the appropriate approach is from the prosecutor's perspective. But in the meantime, Summer and her family had a lot of immediate emergencies to deal with. The first was a funeral. So funerals run $7,000 to $8,000 in Alabama on average. That's a lot of money, and they didn't have a lot of money, but they wanted to honor him properly. So they paid for a full funeral. They pulled together the money they could, and they also applied to the Crime Victims Compensation Fund, which does pay emergency expenses for things like funerals. So they filled out all that paperwork and they sent it in. Another emergency that they had to deal with right away was this little boy that her brother left behind, whose mother in that moment was not equipped to be his solo parent. She was also very young. Now, the whole family loves this little boy. I don't want to talk about him like he's a burden. He is their nephew and son and grandson, right? They love him, but still, kids are expensive. But because Summer's brother hadn't signed the birth certificate and there was no legal connection between the little boy and his father, it was very complicated to get any kind of financial assistance to support this child whose father had just died. And they needed things immediately, clothing, like diapers. I mean, the disposable stuff that kids go through really, really fast. And again, as she was calling the victims' assistance people at the DA's office, was just not getting the kind of immediate emergency help that she needed. Back to the funeral, now I think it's been pretty well documented over the last few months with some stories from AL.com and the Alabama Reflector that the Victims' Compensation Commission is understaffed, and it takes a very long time to get back to people about their claims. So when I talked with Summer, the funeral home was threatening to take her family to small claims court. And that is just an unnecessary stress, as is the stress of having a child who has needs. As much as they adore him, they want to keep him, they love him, but they do need financial help with him. And I think Summer's experience really reflects a lot of what we heard from people as we went around the state. It's not that they object to the court system so much as that they need more for the other kinds of emergencies that occur in the wake of violent victimization or homicide. And so one thing concretely that we need is to figure out a faster way to meet those needs that doesn't require so much of the people who have them. The other thing that Summer does, and this was also common in these communities, is she's involved with other women who have had these kinds of losses, because very often there are sort of communities that experience a lot of violence, a lot of deaths of young people by homicide. And over and over again, in doing this research, we encountered people who are already working in their communities to support each other, not necessarily financially, because there's not that much money to go around, but to be there for each other. And that actually is something you could fund. We have a really interesting model in the state involving peer specialists in the substance use context, where people who have had substance use disorder, who are in recovery, can get certified and trained to work with other people just like them and kind of help them navigate recovery. And I wonder about whether a similar network could be developed of people who can help others navigate after violence occurs. So this is not about like getting rid of the system we have, it's about adding a parallel system of support for the people who are recovering from violence and loss.
I was going to ask, because sometimes that means government, sometimes it means, community organizations, churches, things like that. So is there a private sector, non-profit, do you think that has a role to play here?
I think that there are any number of ways it could get done, and certainly, churches are a major source of this kind of help. Where the state could be useful, I think, one would be funding, potentially, because these are very hard jobs, they're emotionally demanding, and they have found funding for peer specialists in the substance use context. But also in kind of examining the obstacles that people like Summer face in getting money, for that child. And there are a lot of children who are orphaned after parents die. It is not uncommon for people to face the kind of bureaucratic obstacles that Summer faced. And I don't know exactly what the solution is, but I feel sure that you could sit down and think through, all right, how do we create some sort of emergency assistance that's available immediately and doesn't have quite so many legal hurdles to clear for people who are also grieving a close family member, suddenly experiencing family or parenthood, and now, don't need to get 9,000 things notarized. Sure.
Well, while I have, you only have a minute or so left, but there were some findings in here about law enforcement and how folks, these folks that you surveyed, feel about their interactions with law enforcement. Unfortunately, a majority saying they almost never call the police in response. Plenty also saying that they have not been treated with respect by law enforcement. I mean, if I'm law enforcement, I do not want to see these numbers, because if you don't have trust in the communities that you're policing, that's a real problem. So talk about that a little bit and what potential solutions might be out there on the law enforcement side.
Yeah, that was a finding that was pretty staggering, although it's in keeping with national numbers. So nationally, according to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, fewer than 50% of people who experience violent victimization call the police. And we just about matched that number in people who agreed with the statement, I never or almost never call the police in response to victimization that I experience. And I did drill down with people, if you witnessed a murder, would you call the police? And some people said no. And I was really surprised, because I would.
Yeah.
And the reasons were complicated. Some of them felt like because of their identities, they couldn't call the police. So we did a focus group with some people who are undocumented immigrants who experience pretty high levels of victimization and feel like they can't call the police because it could trigger deportation proceedings against them.
Sure.
I spoke with trans women who feel like they can't call the police because there are too many questions about why the gender on their ID doesn't match how they're presenting, and they, in the wake of violence, don't feel able to explain themselves. They need comfort and help, not questions about who they are and why their ID looks the way it does. And even, people in communities with a high level of violence, there may be other issues floating around in the same family that experiences violent victimization. Maybe someone in the home has a failure to appear warrant. Maybe someone in the home recreationally uses marijuana, and those things are present. So when you call the police, are you putting your brother or your sister or even yourself at risk? So people are making a lot of difficult calculations, and there's not an easy solution to it, right? We expect law enforcement generally to arrest people when there's a warrant, when they observe illegal behavior. So I don't have an answer to the question of how we solve that. And it's not something you can blame on individual law enforcement officers. I think that as a state, we need to step back and sort of think about our priorities and who needs what when, and how we can provide a more approachable system for people who experience violence. And what do we value and what do we prioritize when people are hurt?
Well, we're out of time, but we will share the link to the report for our viewers, and I encourage them to check it out. Leah Nelson of Alabama Appleseed, thanks so much.
Thank you.
We'll be right back.
You can watch past episodes of Capitol Journal online anytime at Alabama Public Television's website, aptv.org.
That's our show for tonight. Thanks for watching. We'll be back tomorrow night at 10:30 with more coverage of the Alabama Legislature right here on Alabama Public Television. I'm Todd Stacy. We'll see you next time.